looking at this topic, how could anybody hate Animal Crossing New Leaf? I mean, it was a top seller on the 3DS, it defined a generation, was the most successful Animal Crossing game at its time, and still some people hated New Leaf? Okay, I think it's important when looking back at games, especially ones that were successful, every once in a while to look at the opinions, maybe as wild as they were, and even if they weren't the most popular opinions, just to get an understanding of a different perspective, and also try to wrap our brains around the fact that not everyone actually liked Animal Crossing New Leaf, which to this day is sometimes touted as the best and pinnacle of the entire franchise. I mean, a lot of people still prefer Animal Crossing New Leaf over Animal Crossing New Horizons, or at the very least, many people have excellent and fond memories of their times with Animal Crossing New Leaf. To be honest, one of the reasons I loved New Leaf was because it seemingly took all of the building blocks that games like Animal Crossing Wild World for the DS and City Folk for the Wii had established, and really fleshed out the best parts of those games into a brand new experience that was just packed to the brim with things to do, new features, and just deeper mechanics than any game before it. It really felt like the definitive Animal Crossing experience at its time. So obviously, looking at the topic as to why some people hated Animal Crossing New Leaf, this topic alone might come to a surprise to you when I point out that not everyone actually liked this game. In fact, Animal Crossing New Leaf was even subject at times to some level of fierce criticism. Maybe this goes on to show that no matter how perfect, even what could be considered collectively as one of the greatest games in the franchise, there'll always be naysayers. But I can't help being curious as to the why question. Like, for instance, if we take a look at a website like Metacritic, which when it comes to things like user scores can be all over the place based on what type of drama is affecting the game that current week, it's still a decent enough source when collectively trying to figure out or understand the critical reception the game had from various gaming outlets at its time. When Animal Crossing New Leaf released, it was reviewed by 70 different gaming publications and scored a promising 88 out of 100. But when we look through a lot of the scores right away, you'll notice that Animal Crossing New Leaf got a ton of 100s, a handful of 95s, some 90s or 9 out of 10 equivalents. Okay, these are kind of what you would expect from a game with the reputation and prestige that Animal Crossing New Leaf has, but when you scroll down just a bit more, you'll notice that there are some interesting reviews that are still relatively high overall, but still definitely without noting some faults here that the reviewers felt that Animal Crossing New Leaf had. Like, for instance, the lowest rated score that Animal Crossing New Leaf had was from Destructoid, which was a publication that had a pretty good reputation back in the 2010s. Sure, a 7 out of 10 isn't the worst thing ever, but where were the criticisms that knocked this game down a peg? Mind you, Destructoid rated City Folk, which is often nowadays regarded as one of the weaker entries in the Animal Crossing franchise, as an 8.5 out of 10. So this is a substantial drop from the game that many people were pretty critical towards. Stepping aside and not getting caught up on the score for a moment, let's look at the actual review here. Early on in the review, this paragraph kind of stands out. Every Animal Crossing excites me. Something about it always draws me in, even though I know it won't be long before my virtual life becomes a monotony of shaking trees, fishing, and paying off loans in a game that perpetuates itself through a constant shifting of goalposts. Eventually, as always happens, I'll get tired of it and realize every game, no matter what else gets added, will always boil down to fruit and fishes. But this time, I get to be the mayor. The mayor! Okay, I think I at least understand what's going to be pointed out as one of the bigger critical issues that Animal Crossing New Leaf got hit with in this specific review, and as I read through the rest of this review, it kind of confirmed my theory, but it seems like Animal Crossing New Leaf, specifically in this review, was criticized for an issue that I feel like every single Animal Crossing title has always run into, and is possibly the biggest issue that players and developers probably face in regards to Animal Crossing, but Animal Crossing Burnout. With any game like this, Animal Crossing, The Sims, Stardew Valley, whatever it is, there comes a point where the game, for any player, just stops having that initial charm that was so intoxicating in the first few weeks of playing, and players get tired and put the game down and move on to something else. There's no amount of content or depth that could be put into a single game that could fully prevent the inevitable burnout death of the game. And I think that spans beyond even Animal Crossing. We see this in so many games nowadays that have these extended life cycles where there's new content being added regularly, new seasons, new events. Unfortunately, Animal Crossing New Horizons didn't really take advantage of that trend, but the avoidance of burnout is something that all games really face. So it doesn't really come to any surprise that a criticism of Animal Crossing New Leaf would be that eventually you get tired of the game. My only real issue with this being a claim in the review here is that this isn't something that is just prevalent in Animal Crossing New Leaf. It's been in every single Animal Crossing game prior, and if anything, Animal Crossing New Leaf was so filled with unique content and things to do that the burnout threshold would have been, from what I would think, pushed way back further on. We'll touch back on the burnout idea in a bit, but let's look at some of the other things that this game was specifically criticized for rather than just general ideas like burnout. While I'm not a fan of how the Destructoid review was written, some of the other specific points that were criticized are at least interesting points to say the least. One of the big draws of Animal Crossing New Leaf that was advertised heavily with the game was the fact that you would get to be the mayor of your town, which would mean a ton of new duties and customization for your town itself. And one criticism here is that the mayoral duties are maybe not as enriching as they could have been, and for most players who don't play into the late game, really the mayor duty just serves as the ability to enact an ordinance which essentially changes something in your town but is relatively passive in its involvement, and eventually you can do public works projects which allow you to feel like you're doing something, but the criticism here is you're choosing from a list of predetermined structures and you're only able to enact these structures or objects given that there is enough space in your town. These also being cash-driven incentives means that it's just another objective beyond the regular objective of paying down your debt, and like said in the review itself, it makes it just feel like a moving goalpost rather than a fulfilling ecosystem of things to do. I actually understand this specific criticism. I feel like with Animal Crossing New Leaf, and of course, once again, any Animal Crossing game, the more features added to the game and the more things there is to essentially grind for, that feeling of a moving goalpost can become ever present. But is that exclusive to just New Leaf, or is this something that's in a lot of games? I still think it's a fair point. I think the mayor duties could have maybe had more of an impact in the game. With a game that doesn't have a single player narrative story as black and white as other games, using a tool or function like this to shoehorn a objective list or a narrative list could have been a great way to keep players hooked beyond just paying off their debt as the main objective. Something I think that maybe New Horizons did better in the introduction period of the game. I think this review, though, unfortunately missed out on a lot of the late game content that really just makes this game one of the best long-term Animal Crossing experiences, but I digress. This one was only a 7 out of 10, and the other reviews that we're going to look at are way more harsh, so maybe we're just scratching the surface here. Okay, we've already talked about how user scores on Metacritic aren't always accurate, but they can be fun to read through nonetheless. This review was from 2020, a very soulful and memorable game whose virtual world, every sound, and every melody remains in the heart for life. Thanks for this miracle. 0 out of 100. This one got a 1 out of 10. This is exactly the sort of game that I would love. I spent months being excited for the release of this game. I've never played an Animal Crossing before, and I was excited to experience everything this game offered. Unfortunately, the game is poorly designed and there's only one island per Switch. So when I was working with my girlfriend, wait a second. This person put their Animal Crossing New Horizons review in Animal Crossing New Leaf. Okay, let's not do that. Okay, this review was a 45 out of 100, which is pretty low, but it seems thought out at least, and you know, about the right video game. Animal Crossing New Leaf is an immersive experience full of warmth where the relaxing rhythm of everyday life lulls the player into a state of quietly fulfilling mundane bliss, surrounded by friendly faces in a charmingly peaceful setting. The villagers are endearingly vibrant and unique thanks to the various personality types, even though their presence starts to feel hollow after some time, mainly due to the lack of many meaningful ways to interact with them and a somewhat disappointing amount of lines of dialogue. Nonetheless, the game partially makes up for it through its astonishingly rich customization options, an immense catalog of clothes to change your appearance, but also countless furniture and hundreds of items to decorate the interior of your house and landscape of the towns as well, not only through the growth of various kinds of trees and flowers, but also projects that vary from small fountains to new facilities and new activities. I think this is a very eloquently written review that captures the idea of Animal Crossing New Leaf, but man, they really docked this game for its dialogue options. Nowadays, you hear this brought up quite a bit, how people miss mean villagers. We've covered it in a video, and New Horizons gets a ton of criticism because some players feel like the dialogue in that game is not nearly as in-depth as some of the older games. I do have to say that that shift, though, where the dialogue started to feel more neutral and Animal Crossing villagers were way more nice on day one started actually well before New Leaf was one of those games that was noticeably different with the dialogue system. Do I think the game deserves to be deducted 55 points for it? No, but I do think that criticism maybe is a little bit valid. There was this review, interestingly, that gave the game a 4 out of 10, saying it strayed too far from the original Animal Crossing games, which I don't know if I necessarily feel that way on this one, but they pointed out that the 3D in the game felt like it was a gimmick. Yeah, I forgot about this. When it comes to Animal Crossing New Leaf, the whole game was in 3D, as were all 3DS titles at this time. I think I just got so used to turning off 3D in any 3DS game that I don't think about this as often, but I do remember during the pre-release period of Animal Crossing New Leaf, it was discussed about how one of the big things they thought about was how to make Animal Crossing work in a 3D space with the technology of the 3DS, and obviously Nintendo pushing 3D technology so early on to really try to sell the 3DS, and even though later in the 3DS life cycle they kind of downplayed the importance of 3D mode, this game did do that little depth thing with the 3DS here. And yeah, in general, a lot of players felt like the 3D mode on the 3DS was relatively gimmicky. I don't know if this is necessarily a fault of Animal Crossing New Leaf specifically, or just Nintendo's mindset with the handheld console and maybe overbanking on how successful 3D would become and how widespread people would want 3D technology. Remember, in the 2010s, they were trying to sell 3D televisions, so a 3DS handheld that didn't require glasses was a big deal. They definitely thought that was the big selling point for the handheld. So I guess New Leaf does always have to be attributed to the fact that it did release on a console that had this weird 3D functionality. Okay, it's also worth noting, after looking through some more of these reviews, in 2023, when we look back at New Leaf, we can see the game for its entirety. We can see the depth that the game went into and how it stood out against older titles, and even how it stands out today against a newer title like New Horizons. However, after looking at some of the reviews posted during the time that the game actually originally released, I can kind of see how some players who had played all the other games were feeling that the early stages of this game were somewhat redundant. The first few days in the town of Animal Crossing New Leaf do feel incredibly similar to the first few days on the GameCube version, or the DS version, or the Wii versions of the game. They take a little bit of time to establish yourself as a mayor, but other than that, the big, new, massive changes don't become something that you get to experience until you've put quite a bit of time into the game and you build up your town and your main street starts to open up new shops along the way. Matter of fact, City Folk had more things to do in its city area on day one, and now with the reduction of it to just being like a little main street with New Horizons, there were less things open early on in this version. But of course, eventually it grows into this massive street and there's way more to do, but the depth doesn't come until much later. I don't necessarily feel like some of these criticisms need to be presented in a way that seems to be harsh and a slap against Animal Crossing New Leaf, because I do think that New Leaf was released in a time where a much needed ultimate classic Animal Crossing experience was warranted. Both City Folk and Wild World each had their own shortcomings, and having a definitive game that has that classic Animal Crossing experience was really good for its time and brought a ton of new players into the franchise. Nintendo has a handful of series that never innovated or had a definitive experience, so the fan bases for those games are just the fans that played the best version of the game way back in the day and are still holding on to this day, and a lot of the times those games end up becoming dormant because they're not attracting new players. Animal Crossing New Leaf was very pivotal because it brought so many new players into the franchise as well. But yeah, it's fair. Much of the game early on feels like the same stuff you would do on, say, the DS version of the game, just on the 3DS this time. I also think it's worth pointing out that despite the fact that New Leaf received criticism but was generally very well received, put Nintendo in an interesting predicament, because they could have chosen to just ignore the criticism that it did have because New Leaf was so well received mostly across the board, but instead they took a lot of this criticism to heart, because I do think that New Leaf's first couple of hours being criticized as too similar to the previous games may have been influential to New Horizons, because New Horizons opening when you're getting started for the first time is dramatically different from any of the previous Animal Crossing experiences. You go to this deserted island, you have to set up stuff for the first couple of days, you gotta get houses set up, and overall there's this quest line that doesn't necessarily tie directly to your mortgage payments, experience that carries on for a few weeks up to almost a month of just tasks to do to get everything set up to let the player just go and experience the deeper game. Nowadays, New Horizons is criticized for not being enough like New Leaf, but them stepping out and overhauling the first 20 hours of experience probably did the same thing that New Leaf did and allowed New Horizons to be accessible to new and old players in a really exciting way that pushed this game into being as successful as it was, being one of the top Switch games, also released during a time where obviously the game could perform at its best, which was kind of just dumb luck. It's interesting, I found this Reddit post from 10 years ago where someone is asking whether or not Animal Crossing New Leaf is even worth buying because they were such a fan of City Folk and felt like the game would not be a new enough experience. He did end up buying Animal Crossing New Leaf. I also found this post on a forum where one person was talking about how an Animal Crossing City Folk, but going back and revisiting that game feels like it runs at such a higher resolution and 60 frames per second, making the whole experience smoother. Sure, Animal Crossing New Leaf might have had the newer proportions with the Villager 3.0 going on, but yeah, the game does feel way smoother on City Folk than New Leaf. New Leaf does run at a lower frame rate, and it runs at that handheld resolution, and City Folk was built as a home console game and just felt low-key buttery smooth across the board, but still didn't have the depth that New Leaf had. I think if anything though, the one thing that we can take away from looking at the criticism from Animal Crossing New Leaf is maybe hope for the future of Animal Crossing. Animal Crossing New Horizons on the Switch sold the best that the franchise had ever seen. It is the second best-selling Switch game of all time. And despite the fact that the game had very good reviews across the board, there's still some things to be desired for in Animal Crossing New Horizons. A lot of things from the root experiences of older Animal Crossing games that unfortunately never made their way back into that game. Animal Crossing New Leaf had a lot of those core experiences, but was criticized for it being too similar, even though it had good reviews, but it showed that Nintendo was listening to even the bad reviews and possibly created a brand new opening experience for players with Animal Crossing New Horizons and chose which parts of Animal Crossing New Leaf to evolve and implement for the new Switch game. Despite New Horizons' great reviews nowadays, I would be very surprised if when we do get a follow-up Animal Crossing game, they don't still look at the more obscure discussions about Animal Crossing and see the things that the fan base really would have liked to see in New Horizons that never actually ended up coming into fruition. A lot of those original experiences, even if they were in previous games, could be brought back into a new Animal Crossing game and feel not only fresh again, but tied that to a lot of the newer mechanics introduced in New Horizons. I think the possibilities are pretty endless. We could really use that deeper dialogue though, for sure. Do I think Animal Crossing New Leaf was deserving of some of the hate that some of the fan base gave this game? I don't think hate is the right word. I do think there were some sections that could have been improved upon, and the criticism is valid. I don't think the general hate towards the game though is equal to the shortcomings that New Leaf had either. I still think that this game is a solid masterpiece. And I recently did a video where I compared Animal Crossing New Leaf to New Horizons, and I think everybody assumed I was going to say New Leaf was the better one, and we're somewhat surprised with some of the things I had to say about New Horizons, so you can always go check that video out next. But nonetheless, I do think Animal Crossing New Leaf is an amazing experience. I think it's a great game. I'd love to see it ported one day into the future, but I think ultimately serves as a testament to a time period of Animal Crossing where maybe the player base didn't even realize that they were living in the best glory days of Animal Crossing, or one of the glory days that Animal Crossing would have. There'll always be a naysayer around the most positive video game experiences, and maybe you can draw your own conclusions based on your own experiences rather than just going off of some blind reviews. But hey, that was just my opinion on that. If you enjoyed this video though, maybe make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Look how close we are to 40,000 subscribers. That is a lot, and I think you guys are gonna like what we're coming up with next. It might be a little bit still, but something involving City Folk and a couple of 100 days might be coming in the future. Those videos just take a long time, so we might have some other cool stuff to look at before then, but you want to be subscribed with notifications on just to see what we have coming up. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you guys all next time with a brand new video.